Welcome to Wisdom Trek with Gramps. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, and we are on day 2528 of our trek. The purpose of Wisdom Trek is to create a legacy of wisdom, to seek out discernment and insights, and to boldly grow where few have chosen to grow before. In today's Wisdom Nugget, we'll explore Psalm 38, verses 1 through 8 from the New Living Translation. This is a deeply personal and heartfelt prayer from David as he cries out to God in a time of anguish. These verses gives us a glimpse of David's raw emotion, his recognition of sin's weight, and his desperate plea for God's mercy and healing. Psalm 38 is often referred to as a penitential psalm, one in which David expresses his sorrows for his sins and reflects on his physical, emotional, and spiritual toll of his transgressions. It's a powerful reminder of our needs for God's grace and the hope of his unfailing love. Let's start by reading the passage together, Psalm 38, verses 1 through 8. O Lord, don't rebuke me in your anger, or discipline me in your rage. Your arrows have struck me deep, and your blows are crushing me. Because of your anger, my whole body is sick. My health is broken because of my sins. My guilt overwhelms me. It is a burden too heavy to bear. My wounds fester and stink because of my foolish sins. I am bent over and racked with pain. All day long I walk around filled with grief. A raging fever burns within me, and my health is broken. I am exhausted and completely crushed. My groans come from an anguished heart. David begins his psalm in verse 1 with an urgent plea. O Lord, don't rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your rage. These opening verses reveal David's deep awareness of his sin and his fear of God's righteous judgment. He knows that he has fallen short, and he acknowledges God's right to discipline him. Yet he appeals to God for mercy, asking that his discipline not come from a place of anger or rage. In verse 2, David continues, Your arrows have struck me deep, and your blows are crushing me. Here David uses a vivid imagery described in the intensity of his suffering. The arrows symbolize the conviction that he feels, piercing him deeply, while the blows represents the weight of God's discipline. David's words remind us that sin has real consequences, not only in our relationship with God, but also in our overall well-being. This cry for mercy brings to mind the story of a young boy who accidentally broke his father's prized antique clock. Overwhelmed with his grief and fearing his father's anger, trembling as he awaited judgment. Instead of responding in rage, the father knelt down, embraced his son, and explained the importance of honesty and responsibility. The father's response was firm but loving, showing the boy that discipline and mercy can coexist. Similarly, David appeals to God's mercy, trusting his discipline is rooted in love. In verses 3 and 4, David describes the physical, emotional, and spiritual toll of his sin. Because of your anger, my whole body is sick. My health is broken because of my sin. My guilt overwhelms me. It is a burden too heavy to bear. These verses highlight the essential truth. Sin affects every part of our being. David's body is sick, and his health is broken because of the weight of this guilt. He feels crushed under the burden of his wrongdoing, unable to find relief. This overwhelming guilt is like a heavy load that cannot carry on its own. Have you ever carried a backpack that was far too heavy? Imagine hiking up a steep mountain trail with an overloaded pack. Each step becomes harder. Your back aches, your legs tremble under the strain. Now imagine somebody stepping in to share that load, lightening your burden so that you can continue on your journey. This is what David longs for, a release from the crushing weight of his guilt. And this is exactly what Christ offers us. When we come to him in repentance, he invites us to exchange our heavy burdens with his light yoke, offering forgiveness and freedom. David continues his lament in verse 5. My wounds fester and stink because of my foolish sins. Now this graphic description of festering wounds paints a vivid picture of how unchecked sin can fester in our lives, leading to pain, shame, and brokenness. David acknowledges that his suffering is the result of his own foolishness, and his choices have led him to this point. Sin often starts small, like a minor cut, but when ignored and left untreated, it can grow into something much worse. I once heard of a story of a gardener who noticed a tiny vine creeping up the side of his house. At first he thought it was harmless, even charming. But over time, the vine grew stronger and began to damage the walls, forcing him to remove it before it caused serious structural harm. Sin is much the same. If we don't address it, it can grow and cause us deep, lasting damage in our lives. Now, David's words challenge us to reflect an area of our lives where we might allow sin to take root. By bringing our struggles to God and seeking His forgiveness, we can prevent these wounds from festering and find healing in His grace. In verses 6 and 7, David describes an all-encompassing nature of his pain. I am bent over and racked with pain. All day long I walk around filled with grief. A raging fever burns within me, and my health is broken. David's physical suffering mirrors the emotional anguish. He is bent over, weighed down by pain and grief, and even his health is deteriorated under the strain. This raging fever, he mentions, may not only refer to a physical ailment, but also the burning guilt and inner turmoil that he feels. When one part of our being is out of alignment, whether through sin, stress, or emotional struggles, it can impact every other area of our lives. Modern medicine has shown that guilt, shame, and unaddressed emotional pain can be manifested in physical symptoms, much like what David describes here. A woman I once knew shared how carrying a weight of unresolved conflict with a close friend had taken a toll on her. She developed chronic headaches and sleeplessness until she finally sought reconciliation. Once she confessed her part in the conflict and repaired her relationship, her physical symptoms began to improve. David's experience shows us that unconfessed sin and unresolved issues can have a similar impact. But when we turn to God, He begins the process of restoration. David concludes this section with the raw expression of inner turmoil. I am exhausted and completely crushed. My groans come from an anguished heart. These words capture the depth of David's despair. He is physically exhausted, emotionally overwhelmed, and spiritually crushed. His groans are not merely sounds, they are cries of a heart burdened by guilt and longing for relief. This verse reminds us that it's okay to bring our anguish to God. David doesn't try to hide his pain or present a polished version of himself. He pours out his heart honestly and vulnerably. God invites us to do the same. When we feel crushed by life's burdens, we can bring our groans, our exhaustion, and our brokenness to Him, trusting that He hears and that He cares. A story from the life of Martin Luther illustrates this point. During a time of great personal struggle, Luther wrote a letter to his friend in which he admitted feeling overwhelmed by guilt and spiritual anguish. Yet, in the same letter, he reminded himself of God's promise of grace and forgiveness, declaring, I am His and He is mine. Luther's honesty with both his friend and God mirrors David's raw expression of his heart, showing that it is in our moments of deepest anguish that God's grace shines the brightest. So what's our lessons for today? Psalm 38 verses 1 through 8 offers us a powerful lesson about sin, repentance, and God's mercy. Here are a few key takeaways. First, acknowledge your need for mercy. Like David, we must recognize our need for God's grace and approach Him with humility, trusting in His loving discipline rather than fearing His anger. Second, recognize the weight of sin. Sin impacts every part of our being, our physical health, emotional well-being, and spiritual relationship with God. By addressing it early, we can prevent a deeper pain and experience healing. Third, confess and seek restoration. David's transparency reminds us that we don't have to carry the weight of guilt alone. Through confession, we find forgiveness and strength to move forward. And fourth, bring your anguish to God. God invites us to come to Him with our raw emotions, our pain, and our groans. He is a compassionate Father who hears us and responds with grace. So as we reflect on Psalm 38, verses 1 through 8, let's remember that while sin brings pain, guilt, and consequences, God offers us hope, healing, and forgiveness. When we come to Him with a repentant heart, He meets us with His mercy and begins a work of restoration. Thank you for joining me today on our Wisdom Trek. If you carry a heavy burden, I encourage you to bring it to God, trusting Him and His unfailing love. Until the next time, may God's wisdom guide your steps, and may His peace fill your heart. And if you found this podcast insightful, please subscribe and leave us a review. Then encourage your friends and family to join us and come along with us tomorrow for another day of Wisdom Trek, creating a legacy. Thank you so much for allowing me to be your guide, your mentor, and most importantly, I am your friend as I serve you through the Wisdom Trek podcast and journal. And as we take this trek of life together, let us always live abundantly, love unconditionally, listen intentionally, learn continuously, lend to others generously, lead with integrity, and leave a living legacy each day. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, reminding you to keep moving forward, enjoy your journey, and create a great day every day. See you next time for more daily wisdom.